Chris, before we start going on to why I brought you on, which is predominantly about the grid, which quite a lot of people think they know about, but don't. Do you want to tell us your background and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, certainly. From an early age, I had an interest in science and engineering. Was always one for kind of making things and doing experiments, but electricity particularly fascinated me, and did well at school and got a university scholarship to study electrical engineering at university, and that was awarded by the then Central Electricity Generating Board. And I did 5 years at university, including a master's degree in motor control. And then I joined the electricity supply industry, went through their graduate training program and worked in the electricity supply industry for over 20 years. And then I joined Rolls Royce as an electrical systems specialist for another 16 years. And then I retired.
In a nutshell, then, when you're, when you were involved within the industry, obviously what attracted me to you was your knowledge of the grid. Do you want to kind of elaborate on pretty much how does this thing work?
Well, what happens is electricity is generated from various sources, and it's more efficient to transmit it at high voltage. So at these sources, for example, nuclear power stations, wind turbines, gas-fired power stations, there are transformers which transform the electrical energy up to much higher voltage, typically 400,000 volts for efficient transmission. And then it's distributed to various customers, and the voltage is transformed by different transformers down to levels that suit the equipment. For example, some customers will take electricity at 132,000 volts. Typical domestic customers like yourself and myself, it'll be 230 volts from the mains.
Right. And, ultimately, one of the things I'm thinking of is when we turn on a light, how much goes into it before that?
Well, what happens when the light is turned on is, or any other electrical appliance is turned on, electricity from these generating sources like power stations or wind turbines, they come through the grid and it's successively transformed down to 230 volts to meet the requirements of your house, lighting, all sorts of demands, washing machines, tumble dryers.
Right. So what's the biggest hurdles for all these new power sources now?
Well, it's important to realise another function of the grid is the grid connects all these power stations up together, and that's basically a form of insurance, that if one power station fails due to a fault or the other, the others can immediately pick up the load and make good the loss. If you lose major generating plant, the system electrical frequency, which in this country is 50 hertz, falls slightly, and the control systems of the remaining power stations admit some more steam or gas to the turbines to restore demand, obviously, to restore power output. Obviously, that's a bit difficult for things like wind power or solar power, which aren't so easily controllable.
Okay. So what is something about the grid that people actually do not understand? Or they misunderstand, shall we say?
Well, there is an example I can think of where they misunderstood it with fatal consequences. I think a lot of people are familiar with phone lines across the street. And when they see a power line, particularly on a wood pole line, they think it's a telephone line, and they don't realise it's charged with electricity at 11,000 volts or 33,000 volts. And there's been instances where people, for example, with scaffolding, have walked underneath these poles, and the electricity has flashed down through the pole, down through them to earth, and killed them. There have been cases of people who actually survived shocks like that. One person had his arms and legs removed essentially by that, and somehow survived. So that is a misconception. I think people often don't realise just how dangerous electricity can be. I think most people treat it with respect.
How close are we to blackouts then? Because that's something I have come across a few times. I have had people on the show as well speak about it. What is the kind of situation that we're in at the moment with regards to people bringing that to the table?
I think, first of all, we are somewhere away from blackouts. And secondly, I don't think the blackouts will be as serious as some people fear. Now, I'll deal with the second point later. But at the moment, we have closed down reliable coal-fired power stations in favour of renewable energy and some energy storage and gas, because gas emits less carbon dioxide than coal. So we are starting to rely on gas-fired power stations, but some of these were built about 30 years ago. I was involved in some of the work on that, and I think, goodness me, was it really 30 years ago? So they're starting, well, like myself, starting to show age a bit.
Guys, I'm sorry to interrupt this show, and I really hope you're enjoying it. One thing I'm going to ask you, if you're listening to it and you're not liking, following or subscribing to it, could I ask a massive favour that you do? It really helps the show, it helps me bring in more people, and it helps me get more stories out there, which in favour brings more stories back in. Let's get back to it.
The one about the blackouts, the effects of them, I think that these are, if, for example, we find we have the mismatch between generation and demand is 5%, then, for example, no, we don't have enough wind, or it's night when there's no solar power, is what happens is the frequency gradually falls and there's automatic disconnection that automatically disconnects circuits to shed load to stop the frequency going down. Now, if you have a 5% mismatch, that means 1 in 20 customers go off, and that would persist for about 2 hours while perhaps the wind picks up or the demand loses. So you're talking about, if we went into that, you'd talk about every month a person would go off for about 2 hours, and there'd be rota disconnections. Now, the effect of that, it wouldn't be like blacking out Wales for a couple of weeks or anything stupid like that, but it would be an inconvenience. So you would suffer a power cut roughly of 2 hours for about a month. Now, that would be quite unacceptable to most people. I mean, it's bad luck for anyone, say, on kidney dialysis at home. Fortunately, hospitals have standby supplies, and in a situation like that, hospitals are the last to be switched off. They are ring-fenced, and they have their own dedicated circuits.
So, I mean, one of the things I have seen a lot on your LinkedIn is it Dunkelfloat? I don't know how to pronounce that.
Oh, Dunkelfloat.
Yeah,
Dunkelfloat.
Yeah, what is that?
Well, first of all, it's a German word because the Germans have first started to encounter this problem with switching off a lot of their conventional plants and replacing them with renewable energy. Dunkelflaut is the German word meaning dull, calm weather. In other words, the weather actually we had, I think, a couple of days ago, where it's dull, there's no wind, so of course you've got no help from wind power, very little help from solar power because it doesn't work very well at cloudy weather, and of course it doesn't work at night, so you've got no renewable energy. Bear in mind that this time of the year, in January, nighttime is about 16 hours in the winter, and even then it's pretty poor sunshine during the day. So we can sometimes have about a week of that. Last year, around about October, there was 6 days of Dunkelflaut, where our solar power and wind power combined together generated only 3 gigawatts, compared with a national demand of something like 42 gigawatts. So people then say, well, what we'll do is we'll build a large amount of energy storage, but they forget about the cost of that. That is going to be very expensive. We do have some pumped hydroelectric storage in this country, mainly in Wales and Scotland, but those good sites have been developed, and the question is, would the Scottish and Welsh want more pumped storage installed in their countries to essentially supply English demand for renewable energy? Well, at least the Scots and the Welsh may be paid for that, but there'd be a lot of environmental objections, you can imagine.
Yeah. So in terms of, battery storage for, let's just say we go into, well, actually, probably best actually touching on that. Solar and wind, can that be a baseload for the UK? Theoretically speaking.
Well, depends on, it can if you have sufficient energy storage.
And how much storage do you need for that?
Well, a good example I often use is the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, which is about, I think 230 meters high. I'm not sure, maybe feet. If you had a battery energy storage system the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza, that would keep this country's electrical demand supplied for about 10 hours. If you want more storage, just add more pyramids. And that's just the electrical demand of the country.
Right.
If we were then talking about replacing natural gas, replacing that demand with electricity, you'd require even more pyramids.
Wow. Right. Okay. And if you were to eliminate gas, let's say, as a base load, and nuclear, and because obviously this is one of the things that people are trying to move towards this 100% near enough, just relying on that. How many of these pyramids would you need?
Well, if you're going to supply the electrical demand alone, then I suppose 10 hours, if I was talking about 6 days we had recently, I think it's sort of the order of about, I'm trying to think really now, let's do the maths in my head. I'm meant to be an engineer.
No, no pressure.
But
Good day, I was getting it right.
yeah, I think it's 15 pyramids. Now, obviously, they wouldn't all be made as a pyramid. You distribute them around the country. But that's the sort of scale of anything you need. And you think, right, a great pyramid worth of anything manufactured is going to be expensive. And that's not just the batteries. Obviously, the batteries and the electrical inverters and the transformers and switchgear needed to connect the batteries to the grid. That would be all included in the pyramid.
And then, because obviously now we'd be changing, the way the system's been run, obviously relying on gas, nuclear, etc. At the moment, you have to basically you would have to rebuild the grid as well for a lot of this electricity, would you?
Well, if it was nuclear power, you could replant a lot of the former nuclear sites with new reactors, and that's proposed for Anglesey in Wales.
Okay.
Wilford, that's right, Wilford, Anglesey in Wales. The difficulty, of course, is take offshore wind, for example. That's the best place to put wind power if you're going to do that, because the wind is stronger and more consistent offshore, and there are fewer people to object to it. So bring the cables ashore and connect them in at the existing national grid. But unfortunately, the national grid was really based on large coal-fired power stations in the Midlands and northern England, feeding power into the centre of the country. So you'd have to reinforce the national grid in these coastal sites. And of course, because the load factor, that means the amount of time these wind turbines is much poorer than coal-fired generation. For example, you want 3 times the amount of wind power to replace coal-fired power station, because it only works about a third of the time. So that means you have 3 times the amount of overhead lines needed, or cables.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, nuclear power, it requires far less.
So in your opinion, and obviously from your experience, for the UK going forward, what will be the optimum way of kind of, if we keep going on this path, what's the optimum way to actually kind of migrate from gas to, should we say, well, future energies?
Nuclear power.
100%.
100%.
Right.
The great thing is we have enough uranium and plutonium stockpiled at Sellafield in Cumbria to meet this country's electrical demand for 1,000 years. We can laugh at energy security.
Wow.
It was stockpiled there in the hope. It's a long story, but it's been there. It was for a day when we would actually go and build some fast breeder reactors. But yep, and the French have got enough uranium to last them for 3,000 years.
But obviously, the issues that come with the nuclear side of things is costs and time. At the moment, we've got the one being built down in Bristol. I've forgotten the name. Is it Hinkley Point? That's taken ages.
Hinkley Point, yeah.
Yeah, but that has taken a long time. It's still obviously not completed. I take it that is obviously the downside to nuclear. However, we do also have a system in place where we can probably use gas until such time. But how many nuclear plants would we need all across the country for us to basically switch over from gas?
If we wanted to meet our present electricity demand using nuclear power stations, we'd require 15 nuclear power stations the size of Hinkley Point C.
Right.
Now, regarding cost, nuclear power is cheaper than renewable energy plus the amount of energy storage required to last 4 days of Dunkelflaut.
Right. So why aren't we doing that?
A lot of it is fear. People fear nuclear power. I mean, I've visited nuclear power stations, and I've gone through there and been quite happy with them. I never actually worked on one, but the Hinkley Point C, for example, or the B station, it had 3 deliveries of nuclear fuel a week, and that was each one was in cardboard boxes in the back of a transit van. You just require three transit vans of nuclear fuel a week to fuel. Well, actually, I suppose Hinkley Point C is a bit bigger, so you might have to have 6. That's one day. They get Saturday, the Sundays off. So all you want is 6 transit vans a week of nuclear fuel to supply Hinkley Point C.
It's mental actually now, because obviously a lot of this is new to me. I don't know enough about the grid at all. Like I'm almost learning as I go along with regards to the podcast and doing my own research and that. But it seems quite obvious the way to go. I do know one thing is that France their energy is far cheaper than ours, and that's because they've got a heap of nuclear plants. But
yes,
but we are so obsessed in this country at the moment with wind and solar that obviously the grids need to be changed to some extent. Your cables and stuff. I think one of the things we had a chat about is that they're running cables undersea now. Down the west coast, they've run one for the wind power from Scotland to get down to England. Is that right?
Yes.
And then they're away to run another 2 down the east coast of Scotland down to south of England as well, which is
well, actually no, it would be North Wales. It would connect in at North Wales and then onto the existing grid.
And then are they running? But will they be running another cable from the east side of Scotland? Because obviously that's where quite a lot of wind power is going in. Maybe it was someone else where I read it then.
No, you are correct. There's one that's I think it's already been commissioned from the east coast of Scotland, and it will connect down to the north to North Yorkshire. And then there's another one going to be put down the west coast of Scotland from southern Scotland to North Wales.
And it'd be 2 of these cables ultimately, because you'll need a backup in case one of them goes down, would you?
Yes, you will. I think they'll probably actually. I don't know whether they're actually going to run 2 circuits down each side, 2 circuits in the east and 2 circuits in the west. Not sure about that, but it's the undersea cables don't come cheap.
No, I was just going to say I'd love to know the cost difference in running pylons down the country and undersea cables down the country, because it's not just a case of hiring a boat in and laying cables. It's all the other vessels and whatnot, and the manufacturing side of things that obviously they've been manufacturing in pylons and whatnot, but. It's not really a cheap boat run, should we say?
No, the cost of overhead lines versus underground cables on land, the ratio is 10 to 1, cables being far more expensive. Now, I'm told, and you might be able to answer this one, Joe, that the cost of doing work offshore is 6 times that of onshore.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. Easy.
Yeah, we can imagine that. I mean, someone told me that, and I wish I got him to give me a reference. But so, in other words, we're talking about the cost of running cables, undersea cables, is 60 therefore times the cost of overhead lines down from Scotland to England. Now there are already 2 400 kV double circuit lines from Scotland down to England. Those have been there for about 30 odd years. But this is it. People say, "Oh, put the circuits underground." Yeah, okay, how much is that going to cost? And given that people's electricity bills are already far too high in many people's opinions.
So I'm thinking now, if you were just to go, let's say you just decided you scrap the renewable side of things, you just went nuclear. How much of a change would the grid need upgraded to handle the however many power plants we'd need?
Depends where you put the nuclear power stations, but it would. I mean, given that many of them could be sited at existing sites, the amount of system reinforcement you'd need would be far less than you would for renewable energy, because of course renewable energy is intermittent, so you've got to install much more of it to produce the same amount of electrical energy as nuclear power.
It baffles me a bit. Like, don't get me wrong, I try and avoid the kind of the 2 sides to the argument. Should I say I'm neither pro oil and gas, neither I'm pro renewables. I think every energy source has its place, but I am pro common sense. And
yes,
when that's staring you in the face, and it's not yourself, I've heard it from, it's others as well. You do kind of wonder why we wouldn't do the more idealistic thing. I think wind does have its place. I've said that a few times, especially for maybe more remote areas, and remote towns. Like I was offshore once, actually we were building a wind farm, funny enough, and I think it was a warranty surveyor that says to us, when you're building them, you'd be more ideal catering towards small seaside towns, so to speak, where you could almost build their own grid and then tie it back to this wind farm and have their own storage ports and stuff like that. But to support an actual country's requirement on just wind, he said, I don't think I could ever see that happening. He says, because there's just too much demand and there's too much intermittency to be reliant on that. If you, at the moment, it's in Scotland, we don't get that much sun, let alone, in the summer we get a couple of days, let's say, if we're lucky. We get plenty of wind, which is brilliant. But when it, say you just sat there and you were totally relying on that, and when, we had quite a good summer last year, if I remember right, and it wasn't actually as breezy, and I live on the coast, and what do? If you've not got something to back you up, the gas, to back you up, or the nuclear to kick in, and I just feel the more and more I've gone into this, even speaking to different people, nuclear does seem like the most obvious, way of going forward and coming away from gas. If you were a way to do it, throw everything at that. But I don't feel like the government's really taking that approach. I know they've done a couple of token gestures in the last budget, but it doesn't feel like they've really taken it that seriously.
I agree with what you say about renewable energy having its place. I think for remote areas, it can be a very cost-effective solution. In fact, I say to people, if you really want in a remote area, try outer space. Almost all our satellite services come courtesy of solar power.
Oh, there you go. That's perfect then, isn't
it? If anyone accuses me of being anti-solar power, I say no. No, we rely on our satellites. And I think all of our knowledge of Mercury, the planet Mercury, has come via solar power as well.
Oh, there you go. So there's one to put in there.
There is.
I have read a few of your things commenting on the link between gas prices and electricity costs. How come gas still has such a grip on the UK's energy prices?
Simply because storage is too expensive. It's cheaper to burn natural gas than build storage and charge it with renewable energy.
So why are we still basing it on that in terms of, obviously we've got all this renewable capacity coming online. How is it still so set on that price?
Well, partly it's a fault of the way the market is all right. Not so much a fault, but a feature of the market is that they pay everybody the same price per megawatt hour as the most expensive generator that's gone onto the grid. So that's how they do it.
Why?
Oh, well, I think that's a good question. If you want a brief rant about electricity market, you only have to ask. My particular grievance is that they willfully. I wouldn't stop the word willful, Chris. They ignore the rules of physics. For example, they say in the retail electricity market that people can choose their electricity supplier. And you think, they can't. You cannot distinguish between the different brands of electricity that issue from the wall socket. The idea of being able to choose your supplier is meaningless. Now, this was done in the 1990s by the then Conservative government to introduce competition into the electricity supply industry. Now, competition works very well in many markets where you have genuine choice. But since you can't really choose your electricity supplier, it doesn't work. And this is one of the reasons why there have been so many so-called reforms in the electricity market, is trying to square that circle. It's a bit like, Galileo when he said that the Earth moves round the sun, and the other authorities said, well, no, it doesn't. The sun moves round the Earth. Yes, you can imagine that the sun moves round the earth, but if you deny reality for too long, it bites. And this is the trouble with the electricity market. They're denying reality. Electricity doesn't work in the way they claim. And if you disregard the laws of physics, there's always a cost.
Are we moving fast enough updating this grid for this renewables rollout?
Well, yes, there's a lot of bottlenecks, particularly in Scotland, where people are connecting more and more wind farms in Scotland, despite the lack of grid capacity to take the power south. Now, that is a consequence of what happened in privatisation of the electricity supply industry when the Conservative government at the time deliberately unbundled generation from transmission to have competing generating companies. Back in the old days of the South of Scotland Electricity Board, the Northern Scotland Hydro Board, and the UK, the English Central Electricity Generating Board, generation and transmission were planned and operated together, as they still are in many countries. So you wouldn't have this situation where they would be building so much wind generation without thinking, are we going to have the grid to connect it? Again, another example of the cost of all this competitive market. I mean, it's a form of social Darwinism that they were having. They hoped that competition and survival of the fittest would eliminate the weaker and more expensive or downright lazy power companies, and that electricity would be much cheaper as a result. Well, for the first 20 years, it was cheaper because we switched to gas instead of burning coal. But as to whether it's working now, well, when I see what we're now paying for electricity, I wonder if this competitive market is really working. It appears not.
How do we change it though? How do I'm just a bit baffled by the way that all these things work, and you think to yourself, there's so much that's getting rammed down our throats. We're putting wind farms up left, right, and centre, solar, incentives and whatnot going up, right? But it honestly, it feels like being in a strip club to some extent, isn't it? The way the government's rolling things out left, right. I don't know if you can say that, Pant. I've not been in any. I've seen it in the movies, but it does. It just feels. It just feels mad the way that all these wind farms are going in, which is fantastic in terms of getting them in. But it's like we're throwing them out, just smashing them out left, right, and centre. But there's no way of introducing them onto the grid in some extent, and it's not, like the grid's not set up for it.
Well, this is what you'd expect from competition. They've introduced competition, so you think, okay, if we're going to have competition between different generators, why not let them compete for the limited amount of transmission capacity available? But of course, that's competition evolution is a very wasteful thing. It takes a long time, and there's a lot of waste. So not surprisingly, we're seeing exactly this happening. Those of us who worked for the electricity supply industry back 30-odd years ago when it was being privatised warned against these various things. We knew this would happen, that we were scorned. They said, oh, yes, you would say that because, of course, you've got a vested interest, sacred cows, and you're only concerned about your job and you're resistant to change. Well, the answer is yes, we are resistant to change, especially for the worse. This was all foretold.
But it was just ignored, as we've seen.
It was,
yeah.
It was not only ignored, it was actively scorned.
Wow. So everyone had to be quiet, basically, in the end.
Well, yes. The view, I remember one view was, well, if you don't like it, now's the time to leave.
Flip it out. Oh, well. I'll say no more.
None of this comes any surprise.
Well, so I take it you've not been surprised over the last, few years. I mean, more recently, the last couple of years, that we're going through this period in the UK that we are. I mean, I think it was yesterday or the day before I seen that we now have the highest business energy costs in the world, or is it Europe? One of the two. It was terrible. Like
either was bad enough.
Was
bad enough.
Exactly. It just doesn't make sense. Everything that's going on, I think I've said that I don't know how many times though on podcasts, that a lot of this doesn't make sense to me. But it seems to keep churning out left, right, and centre. But as this electronification grows, we've got our heat pumps that are coming in, electric vehicles, data centres that are going up now. How much of a strain is that going to take on the system that's already in place?
I think it's considerable. I think we've had, national demand. I think yesterday was at 47 gigawatts, with things like heat pumps, electric vehicles, data centres, and a general more electric society. That's only going to increase. It's definitely going to strain the grid.
And then what happens?
Well, you get some things will happen. For example, circuits will get overloaded. Usually, that's monitored fairly closely, and also the frequency will fall if we have demand greater than generation. And if that happens, they'll have to have what they call rotor disconnections, switching people off in turn. One would hope that before it gets to that, is people would be wise enough to plan it. But again, you see, we've lost the central planning of the Central Electricity Generating Board and the Scottish boards. And people back in the 90s said, oh, that's central planning, that's socialism. And that's labour camps and persecution of minorities and defections and spies and Kim Philby and all that. But people who object to central planning are the first people to complain if their trains don't run properly or other plans fail.
So what's the next essential investment to future-proof this grid?
Well, again, more nuclear power.
Yeah. And that's about it, really, is it?
Yeah, and the necessary transmission reinforcements to cope with it. I mean, all of this will be paid simply by increased sales of electricity. People say, how are we going to reinforce the grid for all these electric vehicles? And I say, reinforcing the grid is actually no problem at all. It's going to be done with conventional technologies. They say, who's going to pay for it? Well, the answer is from increased sales of electricity to motorists. Simple.
Taxpayer then, really?
Well, not really. No, it won't be the taxpayers. I mean, these companies will obviously borrow money to put in this investment, but like any other business, you have to speculate to accumulate. You make investments based on what you perceive is going to be market growth. And
Right.
Charging points for electric vehicles, no different in that respect.
If you had your own, if like you say you had your own way, and ultimately you were wanting to wean off fossil fuels, how would you have done it differently to what we're doing now? Like in terms of obviously, it's not right what we're doing now. Clearly, I think a lot of people know that. But what would have been the better way to do it?
The better way to have done it would have been to keep the electricity supply industry nationalised and maintain a successful nuclear power programme that we had at the time.
But now, that's definitely not going to happen. I think we're far past that stage anyway. Do you think people fully understand and appreciate the complexity of keeping the lights on during this transition now?
I think very few people do, actually, and sadly we don't have enough politicians who are scientifically literate. I think Kerry Badenoch stands out as someone who is actually an engineer. Margaret Thatcher was a chemist, so understood a fair amount of science. But there are far too few politicians who have an understanding of science and technology.
What's your biggest hope looking ahead for the energy future in the UK?
Well, I hope that common sense and physics will apply, and I hope that people will make sound judgments according to physics and therefore economics.
And your biggest worry?
My biggest worry is that common sense will not apply. We will go headlong into this rush for renewable energy and we'll end up paying more for less reliable electricity.
Until when though? What? Yeah. When does it stop? That's what I want to know. When do we stop with this mad obsession of saving the world at the basically at the wrath of economic suicide, which has clearly been, it's clear, it is clear to see what's going on. When does it stop though?
It stops when people start feeling the pain. If, for example, either electricity prices go far too high or worse still, power cuts. I think people are quite prepared, people will put up with paying more and more for electricity despite the suffering. But when you have power cuts, that really is sharp pain. And if people start suffering that, they will agitate for change, chiefly by voting in a political party who at least promises to do something about it.
looking back though on your career personally, we haven't probably spoken about it that often, but I'm sure you'll be able to. What is your proudest moment?
Proudest moment was getting a phone call from a chemical. This when I worked in the electricity supply industry, and we had installed a combined heat and power unit at a chemical works. And they said, since we've had your power cut, well, it didn't actually come directly to me, but they complained, since we've had your combined heat and power plant at our chemical works, we've suffered 2 site-wide blackouts. So myself and a colleague were given the task, right, we've been told that unless we can sort it out, they're going to go and tell us to dismantle our equipment and take it away. So I did what I could. I mean, in a situation like that, first of all, you've got to be seen to be doing something. So I said I phoned up the site engineer. I said, well, can you tell me what's happened? Yes. And he was actually quite good about it, considering his site had been blacked out twice. But the main thing is if you treat it so, I said, well, can you fax me, and is faxes in those days, a diagram showing your electrical supply? And I said, and we'll see what's happened. So I went down and said, right, well, myself and a colleague called Morris went down and with our test equipment. And to cut a long story short, we found that whenever they switched off the combined heat and power generator, they had to put in what they called a power factor correction capacitor to improve the voltage of the site. And when they did that, it operated a relay which blacked out, a protective relay which blacked out the site. So I went down there and found that this was actually the case, and we came up with a reason, and we said, well, what it is when you switch in this capacitor, it changes the shape of the alternating current waveform, and this relay is sensitive to it. Well, what do we do about it? I said, well, replace it. They actually had a different relay on site. So I said, well, swap the relays over, put that one in, see if that one. So they put a new relay on and switched this power factor correction capacitor in and out of service, and the other with the trip system disconnected. And sure enough, the first relay responded when it shouldn't, but we put another one in, it didn't respond. So we said, well, just swap it over. So we swapped it over. They commissioned it and then ran the plant. And 2 things happened. I got a very irate phone call, and I also got a letter of commendation, not condemnation. Myself and Morris got a reply from a senior manager where we worked, and saying, thank you for what you did. You turned a very angry, unhappy customer into a happy one, and we have been thanked by the site management for that. Thank you very much for your help. Now, unfortunately, I didn't keep a copy of that letter. But things don't always go smoothly. I got an angry phone call from the manufacturer of the relay that was faulty, and he tore me off a strip. And he said, because they gave him a copy of the report I'd written on this, and I said, it was your relay that was at fault, and we did change it over for one that actually was working. So I said, we concluded that it was your relay that was causing the problem. He said, well, you haven't heard the last about this. He said, I'm going on holiday for a fortnight, and we'll deal with this when I come back. And I thought, yeah, well, I'm going on a holiday for a fortnight also. We'll see what happens. I heard no more.
Yeah.
So it was snatching victory from the jaws of defeat.
Yeah. That was a good way to end it as well. And I can't thank you enough actually for coming on. It was a bit of I felt like a bit of a beginner in there with a lot that was going on, because I guess it's good for me because I start learning during the podcast. But I guess other people that will be listening in, at least they'll get a better understanding of what happens after these energy sources are produced and what goes on. So I do appreciate you coming on a lot to kind of take it through in more layman's terms, shall we say?
Well, I'm happy to help, Joe, and I enjoy working as an electrical engineer. I'm happy to have come on this. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Cheers, Chris.